Okay, so we're on chapter 17.3. Chapter 17, we've been talking about different traits, simple versus complex polygenic traits, and how evolution happens or how natural selection happens in those populations of individuals. 17.3 is about speciation. Speciation is the formation of a new species. So if things have changed over time, and like the finches, Darwin's finches, at first it was one finch, how did it become 13 different species of finches? So the short answer is evolution or natural selection. Natural selection is how this happened. Oops. That includes mutation, mating, etc. Just over time, the changes that happen, nature selecting for the traits that are most fit for that environment. Eventually, they get specialized to become different species. So when we say species, a reminder, what does it mean to be a species? It's a population or group of populations who can interbreed. Oops. They can actually interbreed and produce fertile offspring. Okay, so they actually have to interbreed and be able to produce offspring that are fertile, is a definition of a species. So based on that definition of a species, what must happen in order for a new species to begin? How does one species eventually split into two different species? What has to stop? You could answer that question out loud. What has to stop is those two species have to stop reproducing to become two species. They'd have to stop reproduction somehow. That's crucial for a new species to begin. The reproduction between species needs to stop somehow. So like I said before, speciation, the definition of it is the formation of a new species. And according to Darwin's theory of evolution, this had to happen thousands of times to get all the species that we have today. Okay, so here's a picture. Over here on the bottom, you see purple, we have one species. And at the top, we have blue and purple, or pink, that's two species. One species becoming two different species. And you can see this arrow here over a lot of time. That is called divergence, when one species diverges to become two. And we also actually see the opposite in evolution too. We'll talk about that later. But two species can converge. Convergent. It's a little bit different, but convergent evolution. All right. So let's focus on the divergence. One species becoming two. They have to do that, they have to become reproductively isolated. Reproductive isolation has to happen where they cannot reproduce for whatever reason. There's actually three different reasons or three different types that species become reproductively isolated. The first one is called behavioral isolation. Behavioral. They're isolated reproductively, meaning they can't reproduce due to a difference in behavior. Mating songs in birds is an example. Certain species of birds will not mate with another species because they don't sing the right song. They will not interbreed, they will not cross over species line because they don't sing the right song. So that is a difference in behavior that prevents them from reproducing. That is the first type of reproductive isolation. And the second, if you look at this picture here, this is in, we can see Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, and Utah. And the pink, the magenta, represents the range of squirrel called the Albert squirrel. And in the light purple over here, this represents the Calabob squirrel. Okay? And these are two different species of squirrels. And you might ask yourself, why would they be two different species of squirrels? Since, I mean, look at this map. They're right next to each other. Why would two species be so close together? But if we take a look at the map more closely, What separates the two is the Grand Canyon. The Grand Canyon is a geographical barrier that separates two groups of animals. So they physically cannot cross that Grand Canyon to go mate with the squirrels on the other side. So over time, because of that geographic barrier, those squirrels have become two different species. So canyons, bodies of water, etc. Large geographic barriers that prevent animals from getting across to reproduce at the other side. So that's the second type of reproductive isolation. The third type is called temporal isolation. It may be the hardest to understand or remember because of the name, temporal. These are species that are reproductively isolated because they reproduce at different times. They reproduce at different times. An example that your book gives is about orchids. Orchids are a beautiful type. Let me just Google it. Google orchids here. Orchids are a beautiful flower, okay? Here's an example of an orchid, okay? And they only reproduce at certain times of the year. Only reproduce at certain times of the year. So let's say you got this orchid over here on the left, or right, whatever you see here, but it's my left hand, and they reproduce January through March. And you got this orchid over here that reproduces October through December. This one only eggs are ready January through March, and this one has a sperm ready October through December. There is no way that this sperm from this orchid can fertilize this ovule from this plant because they totally have different reproductive cycles. There's no way they could reproduce. They're isolated reproductively. It's called temporal isolation due to reproduction at different times. To put it in terms that maybe you better understand, let's say certain humans could only reproduce January through June, and certain humans could only reproduce July through December, okay? Like, for whatever reason, those January through June people couldn't have kids with the July through December people. It just couldn't happen. They would be isolated reproductively, but that isn't the case for humans. It is the case for orchids. And this just shows the Galapagos Islands, the finches that Darwin observed, and how possibly the hypothesis of how 13 species of finches could come to be in those little islands, a group of small islands that are very close together. So this is called the founder's effect. And we kind of watched this in the video, but the first finch had to get there somehow, whether through drifting through the air or driftwood or some other odd reason. That bird had to get to the island at some point. Number two, the islands are very close together, but somehow one bird had to get isolated on the other island. Maybe it got picked up by another animal, or winds brought it in. Hey, Danny.
Hi.
I'm almost done with my video.
Oh, okay.
Okay, hold on. And then so they were geographically isolated. The next thing that could have happened, the gene pools, maybe there was a mutation or something that happened to cause this bird to turn to green or be more highly fit for that environment. The fourth thing that could have happened is behavioral isolation. These birds maybe have a mating song that the other birds don't like, and then they produce a new species. And then lastly, there could be some competition there for different seeds, etc., that could cause them to speciate or to prefer different foods, different mates that could have led to those 13 different species.